My name is Malka Simkovich. I am the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and Director of the Catholic Jewish Studies program at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I am delighted to welcome you all to this year's Spring Shapiro Lecture. The Spring Shapiro Lecture is always a uniquely special event. It is not only part of our annual Shapiro Lecture series, which this year opened with Dr. Alan Brill's Fall Shapiro Lecture in November and continued with Dr. Rebecca Scharbach-Wallenberg's Winter Shapiro Lecture in March, but it is also the plenary event of our annual Chaim Perlmutter Conference in Jewish Christian Dialogue, a conference dedicated, as Sister Barbara said, to bringing scholars together from all over the world to share ideas regarding a particular theme which links their work. The theme of this year's conference is nature and natural law in Judaism and Christianity. Since last April's conference was canceled, this year's Perlmutter Conference and its capstone event, the Spring Shapiro Lecture, feels doubly momentous, but also doubly worth the wait. Our featured speaker, Dr. Christine Hayes, is the Weiss Professor of Religious Studies and Classical Judaica at Yale. A specialist in Talmudic Midrashic Studies, Dr. Hayes is the author of Between the Babylonian and Palestinian Talmud, which earned the 1997 Salo Baron Prize, Gentile Impurities and Jewish Identities, which was a 2003 National Jewish Book Award finalist, and What's Divine About Divine Law, Early Perspectives, which earned the 2015 National Jewish Book Award in Scholarship, the 2016 Prose Award in Theology and Religious Studies from the American Publishers Association, and the 2016 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award. Just a few days ago, Yale University announced that it had appointed Dr. Hayes the Sterling Professor of Religious Studies, a professorship awarded to a tenured faculty member at Yale who is considered one of the best scholars in their field. This professorship is one of Yale's highest faculty honors. Anyone familiar with Dr. Hayes' work knows how well-deserved these recognitions are. Over the past 2 decades, Dr. Hayes has forged new paths in the study of the Hebrew Bible, early Judaism, and rabbinic literature. Her scholarship is widely cited and admired, and its impact extends far beyond a scholarly audience. Some of Dr. Hayes' introduction to the Old Testament lectures have been viewed on YouTube by a mind-boggling 500,000 viewers online, a number that makes sense if you are a singer or a rapper, but maybe less so if you're a scholar of the Bible. I know that Dr. Hayes' talk tonight will be as captivating as always as she invites us to explore new avenues in the world of rabbinic literature. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Christine Hayes.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I had no idea about the number of views on YouTube, so that's very startling. But thank you so much for that kind introduction, both Sister Barbara and also Professor Simkovich, and also for the invitation to present the Shapiro Lecture. Through the centuries, scholars of divine law in Western culture have had difficulty accounting for the Talmud's conception of divine law. And that's because the Talmud's conception of divine law doesn't align with the prevailing scholarly definition of divine law. That scholarly definition draws on a certain Greek philosophical conception of divine law as an absolute and immutable law that transcends history. But as I argued in my last book, What's Divine About Divine Law, the Talmudic rabbis understood divine law as a dynamic and contingent phenomenon that unfolds in and through historical time, and scholars have had trouble accounting for that. So in my lecture today, I'm going to do 2 things. First, I will briefly review the argument of my last book for what Talmudic divine law is not, and I will show that the rabbis broke with the Greek philosophical tradition's conception of divine law as an immutable, rational order transcending history and all its contingencies. And then second, I will preview the argument of the book I'm currently writing, which provides a positive account of what Talmudic divine law is. And I will argue that the alternative Talmudic conception of divine law, in which history and contingency play a vital role, is best illuminated by deploying such modern theoretical lenses as humor theory, performance studies, and theories of play. So to begin with, our negative argument for what Talmudic law is not. And here we must review the conception of divine law that emerged from the Greek philosophical tradition, especially from the Stoics, because it was a popular version of their view that would pervade the Hellenistic and later Roman East and become a mainstay of Christian theology and eventually the Western intellectual and academic tradition. So, responding to the sophists who attacked law and morality as purely conventional and arbitrary, the Stoics wanted to base law and morality on something secure, something transcending mere human convention. And so they chose nature. Now, they broke with a long Greek tradition that, for the most part, had seen nature, or physis, as chaotic and antithetical to law, or nomos. But against that older tradition, the Stoics asserted that no, nature was not chaotic and disordered, but governed by an inherent reason, or logos. Now, for the Stoics, God was nature, nature is divine. So the reason inherent in nature, the natural law, is the divine law, the theos nomos. It's an unwritten, rational order that animates and governs the cosmos uniformly. By definition, because it is a rational order and not a body of positive laws or norms, it transcends historical time and is universal, immutable, and true, not historically conditioned or contingent. So according to the Stoics, the perfectly rational sage who perceives the divine logos embedded in nature will achieve virtue through his own rational nature. But the perfectly rational sage is an ideal. And in general, humans lack the rational perfection needed to perceive the divine logos in nature that is the source of true virtue. And so instead, we must institute written laws, positive written laws, a second best and imperfect accommodation to our rational imperfection. And these laws coerce us to a basic civility, not a true rational virtue. So the Stoics, consistent with Greek political philosophy generally, distinguished divine law, the rational order permeating the cosmos, from human positive law, this second best written legislation and the rules of political states that are particular, not universal, and are grounded in and backed by the will of a sovereign authority rather than universal reason. And these human laws are not necessarily true. I don't stop at a red light because stopping at redness is a universal rational truth. Positive human laws are historically conditioned and contingent. They change in response to the inevitably shifting circumstances of life in this material world of generation and decay. And while we should aspire to bring our human laws into accord with natural reason, this remains always an aspiration. By definition, no written law represents the divine logos, according to the Stoics, nor can it bring real virtue. Written laws, by definition, are historically embedded, particular, contingent, and human. The divine law is unwritten. It is logos, or reason itself, by definition, transhistorical, universal, and absolute. Now, this dichotomy of the unwritten divine law and the written human legislation of political states is basic to all Hellenistic conceptions of law, as represented in the following chart. So let's hope my screen share works. Are you able to see that? And is it obscured by anything? So I'm going to assume that all is well. So according to the Greek philosophical tradition that will permeate the Hellenistic East, divine law, which is in column A on the left, is the transhistorical, unwritten logos, reason, grounded in nature or embedded in nature. It's true, it's universal, it's absolute and immutable. No human law, which now is characterized in the column on the left, which is historically conditioned, written legislation, grounded in a sovereign will, not truth, but convention. It's particular, it's contingent and immutable. No law of that kind can claim to be divine law. It's just simply a contradiction in terms. But there is, of course, an alternative tradition of divine law in antiquity that claimed precisely what the Stoic tradition would have rejected out of hand. And that's the biblical conception of divine law, which is a body of written positive legislation given not to universal humankind, but to a particular people at Sinai, the Israelites, in order to enable the establishment of one particular political community in a particular place, the land of Canaan or Israel. This Mosaic law is said to be divine, not because it's the unwritten and universal rational order of the cosmos. It's divine because it's authored by and is the command of a deity. To say it is divine is to point to its source, not its character as rational, true, universal, or immutable. Some laws of the Torah are rational, yes, but some, such as the dietary impurity taboos, are not. In fact, it is precisely because they are non-rational and therefore not universally observed that they serve to separate Israel out from other nations, to make Israel kadosh or holy, separated out to God. The Mosaic law is not transhistorical. It is given to a community at a particular point in its history. And because it is historically embedded and contingent, it includes a process for its adjustment as new situations arise in historical time and biblical narratives record instances of legal change by Moses and others. And so in the dominant biblical discourse of divine law is written legislation for a particular political community, not universal humankind. It is embedded in history and therefore historically responsive and contingent. This conception of divine law stands in stark contrast to the prevailing and largely Stoic conception of divine law as an unwritten rational order, not positive norms, that was embedded in nature and was therefore transhistorical and absolute. Now, these distinctive discourses of divine law collided head-on after Alexander's conquest of the eastern end of the Mediterranean, creating a cognitive dissonance for Jews living under Hellenistic rule, because the divine law of biblical tradition possessed the features that Greek thought attributed to human law, not divine law. Remember the right column of that chart I had before. And this mismatch was obvious to ancient Jews, and they responded to the cognitive dissonance in different ways. And my newest work argues that these responses can be illuminated by humor theory. The most widely accepted theory of humor is the incongruity theory, which holds that humor is found primarily in an intellectual recognition of an absurd incongruity between conflicting ideas or experiences. According to John Morial, humor is a cognitive phenomenon in which perceptions, thoughts, mental patterns, and expectations undergo a change or a cognitive shift that is abrupt or sudden, but also pleasurable. So he summarizes these 4 features to define humor this way. In humor, we enjoy cognitive shifts. Now, of course, we don't laugh at all incongruities. That's because not all incongruities are experienced as pleasurable. There are 2 basically hardwired human responses to incongruity. The first is a negative reaction that can range from distress and fear to puzzlement. Great distress arises when we perceive an incongruity as a dangerous threat to ourselves or our values, like finding a bomb on the front seat of your car or seeing a parent beat her child in public. These incongruities aren't funny. They're dangerous or they're distressing. Some incongruities may not be perceived as dangerous or distressing, but their oddness creates puzzlement, like finding your house keys out on the curb, as I once did. We're perplexed by these things. Whether dangerous or merely perplexing, we don't find such incongruities amusing. If they're dangerous, we work to eliminate them. If they're puzzling, we work to figure them out and resolve them. But there's also a positive response to incongruity. When an incongruity is perceived as non-threatening and non-perplexing, we enjoy it. Far from wanting to eliminate or resolve it, because we are amused, we want to prolong and repeat it. Now, incongruity has always provoked these basic categories of response in human beings. And once we identify incongruity in a particular cultural context, we can look for clues to determine whether that incongruity is perceived as disturbing or puzzling or as amusing and enjoyable. One clue is whether it is actively eliminated or actively prolonged and repeated. Sometimes one group will react to an incongruity with distress and work to eliminate it, while another group will react to the same incongruity with humorous delight and seek to prolong and intensify it. And this contrast tells us who is threatened by the incongruity and who is not. So back to the ancients. Ancient Jews could not help but be aware of the incongruity between the Hellenistic conception of divine law as a transhistorical and absolute logos and the biblical conception of divine law as historically embedded in contingent written legislation. For Jews who embraced and internalized Hellenistic culture and the Hellenistic conception of divine law, this incongruity was not amusing. It was embarrassing. It was distressing. It was threatening, and it had to be eliminated. So starting in the 3rd century BCE, some Hellenistic Jewish writings place Jewish protagonists in dialogue with Gentile figures who are puzzled by or who mock the incongruous divine law of the Jews, especially the irrational dietary laws and the purity taboos. The Jewish protagonist's response in these fictional dialogues is to deny the incongruity altogether, to eliminate it. So in the letter of Aristeas, the Jewish author portrays foreign philosophers puzzling over the Jewish dietary laws and purity taboos because they contradict both nature and reason, which a divine law just shouldn't do. But the Jewish hero responds that the Mosaic legislation was not laid down at random or by some caprice of the mind, but with a view to truth and as a token of right reason. So aletheia, truth, and orthos logos, right reason. Similarly, in 4th Maccabees, when a Gentile tyrant mocks the dietary laws and says they are senseless and unnatural, the Jewish protagonist responds that the law is rational and it inculcates the rational virtues, precisely because it is divine, and as divine, it must be in accord with nature. The 1st century Alexandrian Jewish philosopher Philo is also sensitive to those who ridiculed scripture for possessing features that appear incongruous for a law that claims to be divine. Angered and distressed by these mockers, Philo also denies the incongruity and insists that the Mosaic law is divine according to the criteria accepted by the broader Hellenistic environment. He says all of the particular enactments, going to the bold-faced text, are in agreement with the principles of eternal nature. And having identified the Mosaic law with the divine natural law of Stoic tradition, Philo goes on to show that it contains rational and philosophical truth. He says, bold-faced here, in it you will not find anything mythical or fictional, but the canons of truth all inscribed. That is, that it is the law of the universal world city is another claim that he makes. It is not the law of a particular people. And he also claims that it has never changed from the time of Moses, it's immutable, and that its written form is actually just a copy or an icon of the true original unwritten form of this law. So for Philo and other Hellenized Jews who accepted the Hellenistic definition of divine law, the incongruity between the Greek and the biblical conceptions of divine law was distressing, and it had to be eliminated by refashioning the historically embedded and contingent divine Torah of Moses into the transhistorical and absolute natural law of the Greek philosophical tradition. But not all Jews reacted negatively to this obvious incongruity. The Talmudic rabbis who flourished from the late 1st to the 7th century in both Palestine and then Babylonia were also aware of the incongruity and were, generally speaking, there are some exceptions, unapologetic. We know this because they too composed dialogues and stories that depict outsiders mocking those elements of the Mosaic legislation that appear to be incongruous for a divine law. But unlike the Hellenistic Jewish writings we've seen, the rabbis were less distressed by this mockery and didn't always rush to remove the incongruity by asserting that the law of Moses is universal, immutable, rational truth, as Philo did. Instead, they doubled down on the incongruity, treating it with humor, prolonging it, and even intensifying it. Against prevailing Hellenistic conceptions of divine law, they reasserted the biblical conception of divine law as a written body of legislation given at a historical time and place that's not universal, immutable, rational truth. The resulting portrait of divine law, as sometimes deviating from truth and rationality, sometimes in need of updating or repair, can be pretty funny to those aware of the Hellenistic alternative it seeks to undermine. But that's precisely how the rabbis wanted it, because humor is one of the most effective weapons for dismantling a mistaken reverence for something that is not, in fact, immutable and absolute. And so, in defiance of those who would equate the divine law with truth, the dominant trend, especially in early rabbinic sources, resists the characterization of Torah as conforming to any standard of truth. On literally hundreds of occasions, the rabbis go to the trouble of pointing out specific details of divine law that do not accord with formal logic, as well as divine judgments that pervert judicial truth and acquit the guilty through an overabundance of mercy. The results can be very humorous in these texts, particularly when God engages in various tricks to circumvent truth or subterfuges to avoid carrying out just punishments. In one case, God stops the angels of justice who would punish Israel for the sin of the golden calf by digging a hole under his throne so that Moses can make a quick getaway and get rid of the calf, the incriminating evidence. In other cases, God blatantly undermines the procedures of the heavenly court in order to acquit those he loves, all to humorous effect. Neither do the laws of the divine Torah necessarily align with the natural order. And here, the rabbinic view differs not only from Stoic natural law theory, but from the approach taken by other Jewish groups, such as the sectarian community at Qumran. That community insisted, for example, that the calendar must align with the actual movements of the heavenly bodies, which are themselves determined by the positive commands of God. They likewise insisted that certain divine commandments, such as monogamy, are confirmed and ordained by the created natural order of one man, one woman. In contrast to this sectarian approach, the dominant rabbinic conception of the divine law may be described as nominalist in that it allows for deviations from objective reality and the natural order. The rabbis famously set the calendar in defiance of astronomical reality. Rabbinic law relies on legal fictions and contrary to fact presumptions that strain credulity and lead to absurd results. Now, the view of law as nominalist, not essentially determined by natural facts, is commonplace in systems of human law. But to many ancients, it would be completely incongruous for a divine law, and for many moderns as well. The idea would have scandalized Philo, but the rabbis seem to find divine law's deviation from natural facts to be funny. In one late passage, the heavenly court assembles to set the calendar and then waits until the rabbinic court has made its determination. But when the decision is delayed, the heavenly court is forced to shut down and pack up and reassemble the next day. Indeed, one tradition says, and oops, I want to make sure I'm sharing my screen again. Indeed, one tradition says, when all the ministering angels assemble before God and ask, Lord of the universe, when is the new year? He answers them, you're asking me? You and I should ask the lower court, the human court. The incongruous portrait of ministering angels waiting for the human court to declare the new year, as if time depends on the actions of mortals, not to mention the portrait here of a fallible divine being who literally doesn't have a clue what time it is not threatening to the rabbis, but funny. Similarly, unlike the Hellenistic Jewish writers, the rabbis seem to feel no distress over the fact that the divine law contains irrational provisions. Indeed, they intensify this feature at times, celebrating the irrationality of the law as a mark of its divinity. Nor are they distressed by the fact that the law is not immutable. Indeed, they will double down and portray the laws of Torah as susceptible to moral critique and modification, and God himself as sometimes needing correction and instruction from his human subjects, again, always to humorous effect. So I suggest that the rabbis' opposition to the prevailing Hellenistic construction of divine law as a transhistorical absolute can be organized under the figure of the jester. In his essay, The Priest and the Jester, Lisha Kolakowski proposes the jester as representing an attitude of negative vigilance in the face of any absolute. And this is a passage from his text. The antagonism between a philosophy consolidating the absolute and a philosophy questioning the accepted absolutes appears to be incurable. It is the antagonism of a priest and a jester, and in almost every historical epoch, the priest is the guardian of the absolute who upholds the cult of the final and the obvious contained in the tradition. The jester is he who questions what appears to be self-evident. The philosophy of the jester denounces as doubtful what appears as unshakable. It points out the contradictions in what seems evident and incontestable. It ridicules common sense and reads sense into the absurd. The jester's attitude is an endless attempt to reflect on the various arguments of contradictory ideas, an attitude dialectical by its very nature, simply to overcome what is because it is. A jester does not jeer out of sheer contrariness. He jeers because he mistrusts the stabilized world. So till now, I've argued that humor and incongruity played an important role in the rabbis' attempt to resist and even dismantle prevailing notions of a transhistorical, static, and immutable divine law. But to stop here is to give only a negative account of the rabbis as deconstructing the prevailing view in their ambient culture. Can we provide a positive account of the rabbinic conception of divine law, focusing not on what it isn't, but on what it is? Well, to date, scholars of divine law have failed to do so. Indeed, scholarship on the concept of natural or divine law in the West has generally ignored the Talmudic conception of divine law because it appears to lack what is taken to be the defining quality of divine law, a static, transhistorical immutability. In addition, because scholarship on divine law generally resides in the discipline of Western philosophy, deploying analytical canons that privilege the transhistorical and absolute, it views the rabbinic conception of a historically embedded and contingent divine law as quaint and unsophisticated at best, illogical, wrong-headed, or irrelevant at worst. So in the time that remains, I will argue that to produce a positive account of the rabbinic conception of divine law as more than a destabilizing resistance movement, we need theoretical models and analytical tools other than those provided by the Western philosophical tradition. We need theoretical models in which the historical and the contingent are not irrelevant and inferior categories, but central and essential. And I will argue that these tools and models are provided by contemporary performance studies and play theory. Because they privilege the historical and the contingent, these theoretical approaches enable a robust account of the rabbinic conception of divine law and the underlying epistemology upon which it is based. So to state the case more plainly, if in biblical and rabbinic tradition, divine law is not a static and transhistorical absolute, but a particular and contingent body of legislation responsive to and generative of the perpetual dynamism of the realm of generation and decay that we occupy, then it is performative. And for this reason, the theoretical lens offered by contemporary performance studies can illuminate the rabbinic conception of divine law. Now, performance studies values performance, which consists of action, as an object of study in itself. According to Richard Schechner, the field considers a performance to be any action that is framed, presented, highlighted, or displayed. Performing assumes both an audience and a consciousness that one is showing or performing. And performance can occur outside of formal performance contexts. And performativity is a term that refers to events and actions, even everyday actions, that have performance-like qualities. So, performance studies holds that many activities can be analyzed as performance. They can be interrogated in terms of their performativity. Now, the rabbinic elaboration of divine law in the Talmud can be interrogated in terms of its performativity. And the following text may serve as a brief example. Here, a woman poses a question about a blood stain. Is it a menstrual blood stain, and therefore she is impure and disqualified for sexual relations with her husband, or not? The text reads, a woman once came to Rabbi Akiva and said to him, I've observed a blood stain, and she doesn't know whether it's menstrual blood or not. He said to her, well, did you perhaps have a wound? And she said, well, yes, but it has scabbed over. He said to her, well, yes, but is it possible that it opened again and bled? And she said, well, yes. And Rabbi Akiva declared her pure. When he saw that his disciples looked at one another in astonishment, he said, why do you find this difficult? Since the sages did not lay down the rule in order to be stringent, but in order to be lenient. For scripture says, if a woman has a flow and her flow in her flesh be blood, meaning a flow, only flowing blood is of legal consequence and not a blood stain. Now, when this wonderful story begins, we think we're alone in witnessing a private dialogue between Rabbi Akiva and a woman, but we suddenly discover that we're not the only observers. Others are watching, and their gaze confirms the status of Rabbi Akiva's interaction with the woman as a performance. So we take a seat with them in the audience, and we find that their reaction to the performance informs ours. They are astonished, and we understand that we too should be astonished. Why? What is astonishing about Rabbi Akiva's performance of the law? The situation described is a situation of doubt. The status of the woman's bloodstain as menstrual or non-menstrual in origin cannot be determined as a matter of fact, and so a legal presumption is required. Rabbi Akiva adopts the presumption that the blood is non-menstrual based on some far-fetched witness leading that strains credulity. Then, in what seems very much like an after-the-fact justification, Rabbi Akiva offers a scriptural support for the policy of adopting lenient presumptions in cases involving blood stains rather than fresh blood. Rabbi Akiva, in other words, steps outside the known boundary of the law and then pulls the boundary up after him so that he is no longer outside it. The amazed disciples who have recruited us to their ranks serve as a literary device by means of which the author of the text highlights and champions the highly performative, contingent, dynamic, and generative nature of Rabbi Akiva's elaboration of the divine law. Now, the rabbis were keenly aware that the presence of disciples rendered their every move a performance that could make or unmake the law. Consider a second story, now from the Babylonian Talmud. The law in question concerns the proper posture to be assumed for the twice daily recitation of the Shema prayer, a very important prayer. And according to the school of Hillel, the prayer may be recited either standing or sitting or reclining, while according to the school of Shammai, one must stand to recite the prayer in the morning and recline in the evening. Now, the Talmud tells us that two early rabbis were dining together when the time to recite the evening prayer arrived. Once Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah were dining at the same place, and Rabbi Ishmael was reclining while Rabbi Elazar was standing upright. When the time came for reciting the evening Shema prayer, Rabbi Elazar reclined and Rabbi Ishmael stood upright. Said Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah to Rabbi Ishmael, "Brother Ishmael, are you simply being contrary? As long as I was upright, you were reclining, and now that I recline, you stand upright." He replied, "I have acted according to the rule of the school of Hillel, and you have acted according to the rule of the school of Shammai. And what is more, I had to act thus, lest the disciples should see and fix the law according to the opinion of the school of Shammai for future generations." So in other words, both rabbis changed their position. Now, since Rabbi Ishmael follows the school of Hillel, which allows any position, he could have remained reclining. So why did he stand up? Because of the potential gaze of a potential audience and a desire to communicate the law's disputed status. Were Rabbi Ishmael to remain reclining alongside Rabbi Elazar, an observer might think that the law has been decided according to the opinion of the school of Shammai that requires that. So to prevent this, Rabbi Ishmael stands to indicate to a group of onlookers off stage, not that the school of Hillel is right, but that this law, like so many others, has not been resolved. There's no single or absolute position. So Rabbi Ishmael's performance prevented the erasure of one legal view. Rabbi Akiva's performance in the previous story created something new altogether. In other words, both performances do something. They have an effect in the world. And this resonates with the concept of the performative, as described by J.L. Austin in How to Do Things with Words. So a shout out here to Judith Hahn. The central idea behind the concept of the performative is that language can actually do things. With this ring I thee wed, it actually creates a marriage and transforms a single person into a married person. This transformative quality of what John Searle calls speech acts is expressed by performance theorists as efficacy, which is the ability of speech, language, and performative events to effect change. So law is, by its very nature, highly performative, creating and transforming realities through speech acts and other behaviors that are framed and executed in a manner that is deemed efficacious. Divine law in rabbinic tradition is no different. This brings us to an additional and central theme of performance studies, which we can add to our earlier list of the themes of performance studies. And that is, and I've added it here to the bottom of our earlier list, the relation of performance to the real and to truth. Now, this question has a long history with distinct approaches that may be grouped into two very broad categories for our purposes, and please forgive the reductive sketch. According to one approach, performance is mimetic. It's a reflection, imitation of a stable reality. It is an unreal illusion that only points to a transhistorical reality and truth beyond it. Plato, the champion of truth, famously banned all actors and poets from his ideal republic because they trade in lies. For Plato, the ordinary reality we live in is already a shadow of the ideal forms of the real and the true. So theater, as an embodied imitation of these shadows, is at a second remove from all that is real and true. Aristotle was kinder to the theater and its ability to reflect reality, but this idea that theater imitates or reflects a separate, true, stable reality was a dominant idea from ancient Greece to Renaissance Europe. When Hamlet proposes staging a play in order to expose the truth of his uncle's fratricide, he exclaims, The play is the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. And in his role as director, Hamlet tells the players that the purpose of playing was and is to hold, as it were, the mirror up to nature. But according to a second approach to performance, reality is not a stable and static thing. Reality itself is a dynamic process, and therefore reality is not reflected by performance, but constructed through it. Performance constructs reality. On this approach, every action, every idea is a process and a performance. So instead of the stable representation of static originals, there is only dynamic performance generating provisional meanings. Paraphrasing Hamlet, Bertolt Brecht argued that art is not a mirror held up to nature, but a hammer with which to shape it. When performance is not about reflecting or expressing a stable truth, but creating truth, then it becomes a kind of play. Now, play is a form of activity that, despite possessing clear rules and structure, can be undetermined in its outcome and exists only as long as there are players to sustain it. I submit that the classical rabbinic corpus of divine law, the Babylonian Talmud, with its famously labyrinthine legal discussions, is best understood in terms of performance, a dynamic activity that generates provisional meanings rather than unveiling a single static absolute truth, and play, a structured activity with an undetermined outcome. First of all, the Talmud's argumentation is staged like a performance. A ringmaster or puppeteer, the anonymous voice of the Talmud that we refer to as the stam, controls a diverse set of characters. Rabbinic figures from diverse times and places are set on the stage by the stam and made to interact and perform. They speak, they object, they respond to objections, they draw inferences, they register disagreement or agreement, and as we shall see in a moment, they bring new things into being. But these highly choreographed performances are also a kind of play in which the stam deploys an ever-increasing level of detail and specificity in a concerted effort to destabilize knowledge, to undermine certainty, to defer final answers, and to keep the game going. I'm going to offer two quick examples. One is patently funny, and the other is entirely serious. And if your head spins, that's okay. That's kind of the point, and it would help me make my final point. So, in one Talmudic discussion, a certain rabbi says that a sukkah, which is a ceremonial hut that's constructed for the observance of a particular Jewish holiday, may be constructed using an animal for one of its three required walls. Now, another sage, Rabbi Meir, prohibits this. Why does he prohibit this? Two sages living 2 centuries later and hundreds of miles away suggest reasons. One says Rabbi Meir prohibits it because he fears the animal will run away, but the other says Rabbi Meir fears the animal will die. The stam, who's orchestrating this discussion, asks whether and when these different understandings of the reason for Rabbi Meir's prohibition might lead to different rulings in different situations. And now the game is afoot. The stam responds to its own question. What if someone builds a sukkah using an elephant who is tied up as one of its walls? If Rabbi Meir prohibits animal walls because he fears the animal will wander off, this elephant is tied. So Rabbi Meir would not prohibit this animal walled sukkah. But if Rabbi Meir prohibits animal walls because he fears the animal will die, this elephant might die, so he would prohibit this sukkah. But the stam isn't done. Perhaps Rabbi Meir's fear of the animal dying wouldn't apply in the case of an elephant, because an elephant is so large that even when it's dead, its carcass would still meet the minimum height required for a wall to be a valid sukkah wall. So maybe he would permit the case of a tied elephant, whether the reason for the prohibition is fear the animal will run away or fear the animal will die. If knowing the reason for Rabbi Meir's prohibition makes no practical difference in the case of a tied-up elephant wall, well, maybe it makes a difference in the case of a non-elephant quadruped like a cow. A cow is smaller, and if it dies, its carcass will not reach the minimum height required for a wall to be a valid sukkah wall. So if Rabbi Meir's prohibition is based on a fear the animal will die and fall below the minimum height, he would not permit this sukkah. But if his prohibition is based on a fear the animal will run away, this animal, if tied, will not run away, so he would permit this sukkah. Not so fast, the stam says. What if the owner suspends the cow from the ceiling? Then if it dies, it will not crumple to the ground. It will still meet the minimum height requirement of a valid wall. So even according to the view that Rabbi Meir prohibits animal walls for fear the animal will die and be too short, well, Maybe he would permit this sukkah because the suspended dead cow will still be tall enough. Well, that's possible, the Stam continues, but if the owner suspends the dead cow, there will be spaces between its legs, and a wall isn't a wall if it has large gaps. So Rabbi Meir would prohibit the suspended dead cow wall. Well, the Stam notes the owner could stuff the spaces with palm and bay branches. True, the Stam responds to itself, but carcasses tend to shrink. What if this dead cow's suspended carcass shrinks just enough to create a gap between the animal wall and the ceiling? Well, we generally say a gap of up to 4 handbreadths doesn't disqualify a wall. And maybe the owner took that shrinkage into account and suspended the cow close enough that even with shrinkage, the gap will be less than 4 handbreadths. Well, that's possible, the Stam responds, but what if the owner in good faith miscalculated the amount of shrinkage of a cow carcass? And perhaps Rabbi Meir's prohibition of an animal-walled sukkah was designed for and applies precisely and only to this specific bizarre case of a suspended cow with branches between its legs. And perhaps in all other cases, he would actually permit an animal-walled sukkah. Now, this dialectical performance evinces a spirit of play, not just because of the humorous subject matter, but because of certain formal features, the endless what-ifs that propose limiting Rabbi Meir's prohibition to certain increasingly detailed and specific situations. This kind of limitation, by the way, is called an okimta, narrowing what a case applies to, a law applies to. What if the animal runs away? What if it dies? What if it shrinks? What if it's suspended? What if it has gaps between its legs? And on and on. The game continues because, as is true of any game, the real fun is in the playing. Although the Talmud stops where it stops, there's no genuine sense of closure. We don't actually ever find out which reason for his prohibition is correct. And there's nothing to prevent us from coming up with yet another contingent detail, okimta. The debate is potentially infinite because particularity and contingency are infinite. We also see here the element of performativity or efficacy, of making things and shaping reality. The complicated objections, the hypothetical limitations or okimtas, reshape the teaching and the dispute. Opinions that appeared to disagree may actually agree in all but the rarest of cases if we introduce enough conditions. We thought that all animal-walled sukkahs were categorically prohibited by Rabbi Meir and categorically permitted by Rabbi Yehuda. But it turns out that may not be so, and suddenly we're a little less certain of ourselves. The Talmud doesn't press to determine which view of Rabbi Meir's reason is right. It's interested only in which views are possible. Now, you might say, oh, this discussion is a parody, and surely serious Talmudic discussions of the law are serious attempts to reach certain knowledge, a single truth. So let me make my case with an entirely sober example, typical of literally hundreds of Talmudic discussions. There's a passage in the Talmud, Bava Metzia, that discusses legal acquisition of whatever enters one's courtyard that affects acquisition for you. Now, our ringmaster, the Stam, asks whether a minor girl, like an adult, legally acquires objects in her courtyard. The 3rd century Rabbi Reish Lakish says that she does not, and his colleague Rabbi Yochanan says she does. Categorical dispute. To explain their disagreement, the Stam suggests that perhaps they have different ideas of how a courtyard acquires. Perhaps Rabbi Yochanan thinks that a courtyard affects acquisition like my hand in a physical sense. It holds an object. And since a minor girl can acquire things by taking them in her hand, he thinks she can acquire things with her courtyard. And perhaps Reish Lakish thinks that a courtyard affects acquisition like my hand in a metaphorical sense. My hand is like an agent commissioned to act on my behalf. And so a courtyard acquires objects for me like an agent. And since a minor girl cannot appoint an agent, Reish Lakish holds that she cannot acquire with her courtyard. A lengthy discussion ensues, questioning whether a courtyard is like a hand in a physical sense or a hand in a metaphorical sense. Biblical verses are cited, teachings by sages from different periods and lands are adduced from all categories of law. The Stam poses objections, it responds to its own objections, it poses more objections, defending first one view and then the other, until it appears that Rabbi Yochanan will be the winner and the game is over. But the Talmud isn't interested in declaring a winner or ending the game with a single final answer. And so the passage makes a sudden 180-degree turn, and 3 limitations, okimtas, are proposed, which completely redefine the original dispute. The first of our 3 okimtas limits their disagreement to the case of a found object. Only in the case of a found object do they disagree. Otherwise, they agree that her courtyard acquires for her. The second okimta limits their disagreement to the case of a minor boy, which is an odd assertion since their statements were explicitly formulated in the feminine form. And then a third okimta combines the two and concludes, perhaps there was no disagreement at all. Perhaps Reish Lakish's negative view referred to a minor boy whose courtyard does not acquire a found object, and Rabbi Yochanan's positive view referred to a minor girl whose courtyard does acquire a divorce document. And poof, the dispute, which was enough to generate nearly 3 pages of detailed argumentation and a slew of ever more precise and detailed limitations, simply vanishes like magic. They were talking about different things. We thought that Rabbi Yochanan permitted a minor girl to acquire by her courtyard and that Reish Lakish prohibited the same. But it turns out that what we thought was so at the beginning is not necessarily so at the end. And perhaps with a few more okimtas, things would look different all over again. And this is an entirely serious and sober legal discussion. The scholarly consensus is that the Talmud's excessive argumentation and endless piling up of detailed distinctions is designed to bring more certainty, to uncover truth, to achieve episteme. I disagree. I believe it's designed to bring less certainty, and I submit that it does so quite intentionally. To understand this claim requires a consideration of my final point, the epistemological function of detail. For all their difference, the theories of knowledge propounded by Plato and Aristotle had this in common. And again, apologies for the reductive summary. For both, the object of true knowledge is the universal form or essence, rather than particular substances. The particular details of a substance, its being brown or white or tall or short, may distinguish that substance from other particular substances in its class. But such details do not contribute to the apprehension of the universal form that unites and defines the class. Indeed, details must be suppressed when seeking to identify and abstract the common essence that unites a group of particular substances and imparts true and certain knowledge. In other words, to know what a horse is, I have to transcend the particular details of different colors and sizes and speeds and functions of particular horses. I have to abstract from all those particular differences the ideal form or essence of horseness. In short, Greek epistemology aims at a unity beyond diversity. Oops, I need to have my screen sharing back. It looks like it's been disabled. If I can just have it back for my last slide, that would be great. In Greek epistemology, it aims at a university beyond diversity. It deems a preoccupation with detail as an impediment to the acquisition of true and certain knowledge. So this is my claim. If the priests of Greek epistemology, I'm using priests in Kawakowski's sense, guardians of truth and absolutism. If the priests of Greek epistemology sought to stabilize knowledge and certainty through abstraction from detail, the jesters of Talmudic epistemology sought to destabilize knowledge and certainty through distraction with detail, in the conviction that truth refers not to an instantaneous unveiling of the transhistorical one, but a continuous, historically embedded, and generative process of contingent interpretation. So to conclude, the elaboration of divine law in the Talmud is both performance and play, and it's a specific kind of play. The kind of play featured in a comic magical show, where every okimta is a wink and the anonymous jester is magician, and the anonymous stam is jester, magician, and illusionist, incongruously conjuring and vanishing objects to the audience's delight. To paraphrase Hamlet, the play's the thing, not because it is nature's mirror reflecting a truer reality, but because the play is the thing, the only reality. And if reality is to continue, then the play, the game, must be infinite. I refer here to John Carse's distinction between finite and infinite games, and I observe that the Talmud is best understood as the latter. A finite game is played for the purpose of winning, an infinite game for the purpose of continuing play. The rules of a finite game are the contractual terms by which the players can agree on who has won. The rules of an infinite game change during the course of play to prevent anyone from winning the game and to bring as many persons as possible into the play. To be serious is to press for a specified conclusion. To be playful is to allow for possibility, whatever the cost for itself. We began with Kolakowski offering us the figure of the jester standing in opposition to the priest, who represents the guardian of the absolute. Reading the rabbis under the sign of the jester helps us understand the rabbinic conception of divine law. Taking aim at the guardians of an immutable divine logos, the rabbis' performance of divine law deployed the destabilizing strategies of play. These strategies include humor, which delights in incongruity, and dialectical excess and detail, resisting the idea of a transhistorical divine law with its attendant moral and epistemological fixity, in the name of a historically embedded divine law with its attendant contingency and dynamism, may be seen as the Talmud's infinite and impertinent jest. Thank you so much for your attention. I know it's getting late for some folks, so I really appreciate your attention.